Does wealth help win custody battles? The unfortunate answer is yes. It can be a game where if somebody has more means, they can stay in the battle longer. And you do yourself a disservice in pretending otherwise. You do yourself a service in understanding that and planning your strategy accordingly. The good news is, judges see thousands upon thousands of cases, and they're used to the patterns in these cases. And if there's an obvious wealth disparity, the judge has the means and your attorney has the opportunity to try to help rectify that wealth disparity through getting a contribution toward your attorney's fees, toward alimony, which is important, and toward being cognizant that the typical strategy when one spouse has a lot more assets than the other, is that they'll play a game of attrition. And so the judge will help balance that out. Custody is not so much influenced when the wealth is disparate. When a judge is looking at a scenario, usually this happens because you've got one wage earner who's a high wage earner, and the other spouse is more likely to be the one who's primarily taking care of the children. And again, the judge sees this scenario often. And so the expectation then is that what the parties have done up to this point, they probably best ought to continue to do. And that's kind of the trajectory that the judge will set. If you can get the case that far down the road to where the judge actually sees that. When it comes to the question of private education and maintaining extracurriculars, like so many things in family law, what the court will look to is what have the parties done? Right? What the judge wants to do is preserve the children's experience in their lives as much as possible. So if they've been attending private school all this time, absent some compelling reason, which doesn't come up very often, except for one spouse saying, I don't want to spend the money on private education anymore, the judge will continue what the children have experienced up to that time. Same for extracurriculars. If the children have been doing, let's say, competitive hunter-jumper, right, horseback riding, the judge is going to continue that because that's what the children have lived with all this time. So it is much harder to move the court off of what the children's experience has been up to this point. Now, similarly, let's say if the children haven't been in private school, and now all of a sudden the idea is, let's say the spouse that's willing to pay says, I'm willing to pay for private school. Well, if you just scratch the surface, what you're going to find out, I'm sure, is that the willingness to pay for private school actually has to do more with control over that education and perhaps even proximity to the school, and the court is not likely to jump into that. Again, absent some compelling reason, and if you think about it from a public school, private school perspective, it may well be that the court has their children in the private school, but the court's constituents largely come from the public school. And so they aren't going to be inclined, and they probably went to the public school, so they aren't going to be inclined to take the children out of public school. Ensuring the children's best interests in high net worth cases is a complicated story. The one that I first go to is that we do a lot of work with pro athletes, and they are incredibly well paid. And they have a pattern of taking their children off for game day. Because, for example, in the NFL, it's a big to-do, right? The children's experience on game day is like nothing else. Now, as the family's coming apart, the mom is saying, I don't want my child to go off to this. And so there's some work to be done on encouraging them on why that's in their child's best interest, because it's FOMO, right? The fear of missing out, what that child isn't getting to experience. And there's a fair bit of going back to the idea of what have the children experienced up to this point, of keeping that as constant as possible. It is the experience that the family has had up to this point, and the more that the family can continue to invest in continuing those experiences, the better off the children are going to be, the less rocky their experience is, the more smooth it's going to be, and the more normal it feels for the parties, right, for the parents. And so the faster they can get back to a new equilibrium. So if you're going through a divorce, and if your situation is high net worth, and you've got to worry about and need to worry about your children's experience, please give us a call to the Neely firm. We're here to help.